Climate change is shaping security, it's shaping geopolitics, and it's definitely shaping the future character of war. And nowhere is this clearer than the Arctic, where warming temperatures are opening new routes, they're intensifying strategic competition, and they're now drawing in NATO, Russia, China, as well as the Nordic states into what's much more contested space. And at the same time, militaries around the world are under varying levels of pressure to decarbonise. And this is raising the important question about how defence institutions are moving towards net zero without actually weakening their operational readiness and their core mandates. To help us explore these issues, I'm joined today by Dr Duncan Depledge. He's a senior lecturer in geopolitics and security at Loughborough University. Dr Depledge, welcome to the International Risk Podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Whereabouts in the world do we find you today?
So I am just outside of the city of Nottingham, which is slightly north of Loughborough, working from home.
Well, let's jump straight in. Climate change. It's often described as something that's slow moving. It's this environmental crisis that sometimes we see the impacts when there's a big storm or a heat wave, but often we still think of it as something that's far in the future and it's maybe the next generation or the generation after that that's going to have to deal with it. But for militaries, there's a lot of pressure for them to actually start looking at it today. And we know that, for example, military bases, and we've had some great conversations on the podcast about what's happening to bases in places like Greenland and Iceland and the Nordics. We know that the equipment of many militaries is being tested, and the Norwegians are doing a fantastic job at really pushing their soldiers and their equipments to see how long they can last in some of the harsh conditions in Northern Europe. And we know that it's not just the equipment, it's the soldiers, but of course the supply chains are under pressure. So when you're speaking and when you're looking and when you're doing your research, what are defence planners doing? Are they seeing this as a challenge that they have to deal with today, or are they treating it still as a future risk?
I think that's a really great question to start with. And if you'd asked me this sort of 10, 15 years ago, I think we would have very clearly said that this is a future problem. It's something that we need to think about, is coming down the line, but it's not something that's going to be a priority. But I think all of us see around us, certainly over the last 5 or 6 years or so, that the effects of climate change, the observed effects, so not the models, not what the models and the forecasts are telling us, just looking out of the window, the experiences that we're having of extreme weather, of the wildfires that we see around the world on TV. Almost a week doesn't go by anymore where we don't hear about another major extreme weather event somewhere in the world. And usually within a few weeks of that, we'll hear from climate scientists who do this kind of attribution science, saying, well, this was a lot more severe, or it was a lot more likely to happen because of climate change. So in that sense, I think we're now moving into this world where we're far more conscious that climate change is upon us, that we're seeing those effects. And for defence, that's an important reminder, because it changes the horizon for planning too. Defence is like essentially like a really slow-moving tanker in many respects. If you look at how long procurement cycles take, for example, it can take 20, 30 years for a new capability from the day that someone starts drawing out the first designs on a piece of paper through to this thing actually being delivered and operationally ready for the war that may be happening. That can take 20, 30 years. If we start to think about what scientists are telling us that the warming effect is going to look like by the time we get to 2050, 2060, we suddenly realize that the choices that militaries make today or in the next 5 years or so are going to shape the kinds of military capabilities, the base locations, the supporting infrastructure that they will have to operate with in these more extreme conditions in the future.
And when we talk about extreme conditions, if we look at the Arctic, this used to sit in the public imagination as this remote and frozen location. And from an international relations and a strategic point of view, it was always seen as generally quite quiet, literally. But that picture feels really outdated today. The region's warming rapidly, sea routes are becoming much more accessible. Russia has had long-standing military interests in the Arctic. China is now calling itself a near Arctic state, interesting terminology. And of course, NATO's northern flank has changed significantly with the joining of Finland and Sweden. So do you think, is it fair to say that the Arctic is becoming the next major theatre of strategic competition, or is this overestimating or overplaying the significance of the area?
I think the answer lies, first of all, in understanding the history of the region, because this is not a region that has been ignored strategically. Certainly not since the end of the Second World War, the region became hugely important to nuclear strategic planning during the Cold War. I mean, this is the region, it's the smallest ocean in the world, it's the shortest distance for interballistic missiles and strategic bombers to travel between the major kind of continents of the world in the Northern Hemisphere. So, for the United States, for Russia, then the Soviet Union, of course, for China, this region matters immensely to the prospect of kind of strategic nuclear warfare, and that hasn't changed. What's different today, what climate change is altering, is by opening up this space, it's increasing the amount of actors in the region. And by actors, I'm referring to both state actors and non-state actors. So if we think of all the various commercial interests and business interests that are evolving up there, so the region's becoming a lot more congested, and there's a lot more competition over how to define who who the region belongs to, what the region is for, how it should be governed. And these are the sorts of things that are now playing out into what I would think of perhaps as an evolution in the strategic competition, but one that climate change is absolutely part of.
This is an important conversation, and militaries have been asked to reduce their emissions at the same time as governments, unquestionably telling them that they need to be preparing for a much, much more dangerous world. And we see that tension, in real life in Europe, as most European militaries are increasing their readiness to actually fight a real large scale war against someone like Russia. But at the same time, many governments are pushing them to decarbonize and become much more green. I mean, a military tank, a fighter jet, a warship, or a deployed brigade of soldiers can't just be made green, I think, in the same way that a corporate building or a vehicle can be made green. So, from what you're seeing and the people you're speaking to, can militaries realistically decarbonize in the near term without compromising their readiness, without compromising their ability to be effective in a combat sense?
I think that there's a lot more nuance that needs to be brought to this to really understand what's going on. The first thing is that militaries are not really being mandated to decarbonize yet. I can't think of any instance where militaries are being told you must decarbonize, you must hit net zero. Is actually evolving from a slightly different direction, and it's not coming from government legislation directly, but it's the indirect effects of, as societies, as countries pursue decarbonisation, and as the global energy transition unfolds, within defense organizations, there's growing awareness that this is going to have significant ramifications in terms of both how people see the military, so reputationally, in terms of, well, if the rest of the world is decarbonizing, why aren't our militaries, and do we want our militaries to be these very kind of dirty organizations in the context of a world that is pursuing clean energy? And secondly, and more importantly, is as fossil fuels decline in the global energy system, where does that leave militaries in terms of, will they still be able to get hold of the fuels that they need? Will the logistical infrastructure still be there? What will the cost of those fuels be? And where will they get them from? Because there will be far few fossil fuel producers in the world. So you're narrowing the pool of production, and that's going to have an impact too. And so I think it's rather than it being we need to decarbonize militaries for environmental reasons, it's actually far more a sense of, if militaries don't keep up with what's happening in the rest of the world, as we see these huge system changes in the global energy system, it's very hard for militaries to say, well, we're going to just carry on using fossil fuels while the rest of the world moves towards other energy systems.
And so, what does that look like if you were to crystal ball the next, even just the next decade? Looking at the sort of technology and the things that were being discussed today. When the military is considering its ability to be ready to fight war, its resilience in combat, the force posture, its capabilities. I'm wondering, where do you see the biggest tensions, and where do you see the biggest opportunities? Where can the military start moving towards a more greener, a more mature and sustainable way of managing its fleet and its resources?
So I think at the systemic level that I was just talking about, so those kind of structural pressures, they're beginning to emerge, I think. And if you talk to military people, I think it's quite often their futures departments, their kind of foresight teams, who are beginning to recognize that 40, 50 years hence, that the energy landscape could have changed significantly, and militaries need to be prepared to adapt to those changes. In the nearer term, I think the focus is more on the fact that how can you actually leverage clean energy technology to benefit the military on the battlefield today? And this is something that was, attracted a great deal of interest already 10, 15 years ago as a consequence of the operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, where one of the things that became a huge source of concern were the attacks that were being launched by insurgents on fuel convoys. So a huge amount of fuel had to be trucked in to support operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, and they became targets. And as a result of the targeting of those fuel convoys, it raised the operational costs because suddenly you had to have additional force protection to make sure that to try and defend those convoys from attack. You had you were to do that force protection. You were drawing combat capability away from the front line, so you were reducing your combat effectiveness. And at the same time as all of that, you had large numbers of casualties being incurred. So something in the region of 3,000 US soldiers, I think it was, were either killed or injured between 2003 and 2007 as a result of attacks on these convoys. And this was more than they were losing in more conventional combat roles. So already back in 2009, 2010, the Americans were starting to look very closely about how do you leverage clean energy technologies to try to reduce the demand for fossil fuel in theatre. And increasingly, those sorts of conversations are coming around again. So over the next 10 years, I think that's where the focus will remain, which is actually, do, for instance, hybrid electric vehicles give us a way of at least, even not, maybe not eradicating reliance on fuels, but certainly reducing the amount of fuel that you need to get to theatre. And of course, the other pressure that's been growing all the while over the past few decades is just the sheer demand for energy on the battlefield, because of there's so much more equipment that is drawing that requires electricity to function. Can fossil fuel meet that demand? Continue meeting that demand, or do we need to kind of move to more, I suppose, multimodal energy systems, whereby it's not so much what matters is your ability to generate electricity and get that electricity where you need it, whether that's produced by traditional sources of fossil fuel, or whether it's by new energy technology.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I lived in Iraq in 2008 and 9, and it was quite interesting. We'd often do a lot of runs between Baghdad and south of the country, and those fuel convoys were their classic target. And without sounding crude, we would use those almost as a defensive shield. We'd try and time our runs so that some of those big convoys would actually be traveling ahead of us. And quite simply, they'd set off a lot of the ambushes, and then we'd be able to race past. And that was when when the insurgency was at its worst. But those fuel convoys were definitely targets, and knowing that you deliberately position yourself behind them and then try and race past when something happens. But it's not a new tactic. I mean, the British and the American and the Allies in World War II were targeting fuel convoys in the Mediterranean, and so much so. I mean, Rommel, one of the greatest generals, he was a German general in World War II, but still studied by most forces as one of the greatest generals. Because of that, I mean, some of his divisions were using about 18,000 tons of fuel every month, and he simply couldn't keep up with it. And Rommel actually said, "The battle is fought and decided by the quartermasters, those controlling the logistics and fuels, long before the shooting even begins." And yet, we're still having these issues today. So I think fuel has been this operational necessity, but also this major vulnerability, really, for as long as we've been using fuel. And as you said, we've seen it in more recent conflicts, but we've seen it for the last 100 years in conflicts. And I wonder, as we start to pursue decarbonisation and whether we looked for green versions or hybrid versions, this becomes another opportunity for us, but it also becomes another attack surface for our enemy to exploit. And as we've seen with Russia in Ukraine, Russia's spending amazing amounts of resources just attacking energy infrastructure. I was in Ukraine a couple of weeks ago, and the amount of the energy infrastructure, in a 48-hour period, Russia launched over 1,100 drones and missiles, the majority of them hitting civilian infrastructure and energy. So I'm just wondering, if we do move from fuel and fossil fuel, we move to green alternatives, are we just changing the threat surface from one to another?
So I think you've highlighted a whole set of issues there, which tell us a lot about how important energy is to war, how important it's always been to the battlefield. The difference, I suppose, today is that we now have more potential technologies available than were available during the Second World War, and they're becoming ever more viable thanks to various forms of innovation and those sorts of things. So that's what's driving, I suppose, an understanding that it could be plausible that other kinds of energy technologies begin to displace the principal reliance on fossil fuels, especially in the context of other pressures on the fossil fueled energy system. This, of course, doesn't eradicate vulnerabilities associated with logistics and so on. I mean, logistics are always going to be targeted, and if you change your logistics and you change the way in which your forces are powered, your adversary is going to respond to try to deal with that. So I think this is why it's useful to try to think in terms of debates about how the character of war is changing, rather than to say that actually energy and logistics aren't going to matter anymore. It's actually that we're going to have different kinds of problems and different kinds of opportunities. And those things need to be integrated into these wider debates that we're having about other technologies that are shaping things. So a really good example is to think about drone technology. So not all drones, but some of the smaller drone systems rely far more heavily on electricity. That's how they're powered. So if we are moving towards a future where small electrical drones are going to be the key here, then how are we going to keep those powered? And we need to think about where we're going to be producing electrical energy, how we're going to store it, and how we're going to move it to where it's needed on the battlefield, so that the drones can be charged or the batteries can be replaced. And so exploring some of those intersections are the things I think where we're starting to see a real need to understand that the energy transition is going to be um, reconfiguring the possibilities of how militaries operate in the future and what kinds of capabilities they wish to use.
Yeah, thanks for explaining that, Duncan. And I'll just take a moment to remind our listeners that if you prefer to watch your podcasts, the International Risk podcast is always available on YouTube. So please do go to YouTube and search for the International Risk podcast, and you'll find our content there. And please do subscribe and like it. That really is so important for our long term success. Now, Duncan, NATO's been increasingly active over and discussing climate security over the last few years, and I know you've been involved in many conversations about this. And I'm also particularly interested to hear about that dependency on critical minerals, around batteries, around rare earths, and technological supply chains. We're seeing some other countries that hold much of these minerals not necessarily being favourable towards NATO or NATO members anymore. What are some of the conversations that we should be aware of when it comes to some of these critical minerals and some of these rare earths, and how that impacts the conversations around military capability?
Well, I think the thing about critical minerals and rare earths is that they are hugely important to a whole array of modern military equipment, right? So this is actually not necessarily directly to do with military decarbonisation or new energy technologies and things. This is about the stuff that goes into computers, into guided missiles, into night vision goggles, whatever it might be. I mean, these things are fully embedded throughout kind of modern advanced military equipment. Of course, one of the tensions that could emerge in a world that is decarbonizing, the military ends up having to compete for many of these critical minerals with other sectors that are trying to drive the transition away from fossil fuels. So that's an important tension, and I think the trick is to understand how can military procurement, how can that be aligned with the demands of the energy transitions to create kind of these sort of win-win scenarios whereby the civilian transition and the military kind of need for critical minerals are supporting each other rather than being brought into conflict with each other, and that's going to be a major challenge. It's driving as well conversations about different types of procurement pathways. So this project that I'm involved in at the moment, which is funded by the UK Economic Social Research Council, looking at critical minerals, is about understanding the kind of social, the environmental, and the geopolitical implications of whether you source your critical minerals from places very very far away versus kind of onshoring or friendshoring, so turning to kind of more regional um, providers, or whether actually you can get what you need by ramping up recycling efforts. So this becomes another sort of possible pathway. So that's another thing is thinking through, if you need these critical minerals, where are you going to get them from, and what is the most kind of cost effective but also least harmful way of procuring those. And then, of course, the bigger picture is the kind of the more geopolitical struggle. We often hear about China dominating the critical mineral supply chains. Is that going to be something that continues into the future? Is that going to be something that NATO countries, the United States, others will be able to kind of break that monopoly? At the moment, of course, it looks like the opportunity for that has kind of been lost for the time being. But you can see now that other countries are kind of frantically trying to find a way back to ensuring that they don't just have this deep set reliance on China for everything.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we've certainly seen that, and I've seen that with a lot of my clients, and especially in the mining sector, about where we're now pursuing mining activities, and what the costs are, and how we mitigate those very significant risks in many cases. But obviously, we've spent and you've spent a lot of time researching and considering the Arctic, and we touched on that at the start of our conversation. And as we discussed, it is one of the regions where climate change and geopolitics are intersecting really visibly. Now, Northern Europe's security geography has changed dramatically, especially since Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And that's been complemented by Sweden and Finland's joining of NATO. And that's meant that the Baltic Sea is now described sometimes fairly as a NATO dominated space. I don't think that's really particularly accurate or fair. I think other actors certainly still maintain a significant pressure there, primarily Russia. But unquestionably, that the high north has become much more connected to deterrence. The undersea infrastructure throughout the Baltic, throughout the high north, linking many countries is critically important. Air defense, the impact on satellites and GPS and flights are all being affected, and we're seeing this in the news quite regularly. How should we see, for our listeners in Northern Europe, how should we understand that link? And is there a link between the Arctic, the Baltic, and Northern Europe?
Increasingly, I think so. Yes, I mean we often forget. Again, just taking that historical perspective, and my first degree was in history, so I think this is why I always kind of reach back to kind of understand how these things evolved. If you go back to the Cold War, when the Arctic was previously hugely important to the Soviet Union, the Baltic states, of course, were essentially on the other side of the line. They were part of Soviet space. That's completely changed now. So this has transformed, the kind of the, I suppose, the NATO's borders, and that of course has only just been continued by Sweden and Finland recently joining the alliance as well. What it shows, I think, though, is that from a NATO perspective now, whereas previously during the Cold War it was all about the high north and the North Atlantic, that Baltic space is now part of what I and some of my colleagues now increasingly talk about as this wider north. That whatever happens in the Baltics is going to be very difficult to disentangle that from the North Atlantic and from the high north, and the same can be said for those other spaces. So defending the high north now requires that you also defend the Baltic. And vice versa, and the North Atlantic fits into that picture too. And increasingly, I think we could probably stretch that wider north even further across to think about Iceland and Greenland, Canada, and the United States. How they kind of fit into that in new ways.
And I think, as we've discussed, and I think as most people understand, climate change is definitely making the Arctic much more accessible, but accessibility doesn't always equal that it's easy to operate there. There's still extreme levels of cold. There's still, long hours of darkness, significant distances, ice, fragile infrastructure, and communications is also quite difficult in parts. And these are very significant challenges for the military to operate in. Now, we know that NATO is actively building capacity in the high north, but those challenges still remain. And we've seen the exercises that many NATO members are now participating in, albeit in small numbers. But I wonder what you're seeing today, is NATO sufficiently capable of operating across the high north, or are we still underestimating how difficult it is to actually project our power that far forward?
So we often think of the Arctic as this kind of single space, but in reality, it's a hugely diverse and geographically varied region. And I think one of the challenges when we talk about the Arctic is making it very clear about which Arctic we're actually talking about and for what reasons. So for NATO, um, the principal focus has always been on what we would think of as the high north or the European Arctic. So we're talking about the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap up over over the top of Norway. We're talking about Svalbard and those kind of entry points towards the Barents Sea and the Kola Peninsula in Russia's northwest. And this is a region that, of course, doesn't freeze. Uh, really, I mean, the ice rarely came down much further south than Svalbard, I don't think. And so these are unfrozen waters where NATO has been able to operate for decades. And that isn't sort of changing massively. I mean, they are difficult places to operate, but it's somewhere where there's considerable operational experience. Where things get more complex is the further north you go, and if you want to try and to get into sort of more ice, let's call them ice infested waters now, because as the ice is fragmenting, it may be that you can push a ship up there, but it's going to be quite dangerous because there's a lot of ice still floating around, even if there isn't an ice cap as such. Um, and obviously, the further you go, the more remote the conditions are, as you say, the harder the communications, and the more strain you're going to be putting on your capabilities. And so, I think this is what prompts the discussions about whether NATO, or the United States, whether they need more icebreakers. Because one of the things that Russia has is it has a lot of icebreakers, which allows it to kind of carve channels through these patches of ice, and that kind of ships can follow through. So, does NATO have that capability? No, it doesn't. Should NATO have that capability? Well, I think it's trying to develop it. The situation is evolving all the time, but at the moment, the kind of the core area of strategic interest is probably still fairly familiar space to NATO. It's that high north region that I just described. Um, and how much further NATO wants to go or needs to go, I think is still to be determined.
Yeah, thanks for explaining that, and certainly something interesting for us to watch over the coming years. And Duncan, one question that we ask all guests that come on the International Risk podcast is: when you look around the world, what are the international risks that concern you the most?
I think the thing that still concerns me probably the most is where the transatlantic alliance is heading, and what this kind of reconfiguration of relations between the United States and Europe will look like in the future, and how that plays out. The there's a huge number of variables still at play here. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen in the next presidential election. So, do we see a kind of a swing back to a Democrat administration, or do we see a kind of a doubling down on the kind of the Trumpist type administration that we have at the moment? And even if it does go back to kind of administration that Europe is perhaps more used to, um, has the trust been broken irreparably and things? So I think we're definitely going to see this reconfiguration of US Europe relations. I think it's going to be quite a bumpy journey, and I think that the way in which domestic politics plays into this is really interesting. So not just in the United States, but also in Europe. If the United States pulls out of NATO, I don't see that as a withdrawal from Europe. I see that as the beginning of a new kind of US Europe relationship that may well come to rest far more on alliances of political interests that align between Europe and the United States, particularly if those are the groups that have gained power. And we see this with the various right/far right groups emerging in Europe and competing for power. And if you had Front National in France, if you had AfD in Germany, at the same time as a JD Vance president, then I think you start to see a very, very different kind of Europe-US relationship. To use the words of the Prime Minister of Canada, a greater rupture between the kind of the politics that's dominating in Europe and the politics that's dominating in the United States. So that would be probably the thing that I think we all need to be keeping an eye on.
Yep, definitely. I think the transatlantic relationship really is a very clear international risk and opportunity, always two sides of the same coin. And likewise, as you mentioned, domestic politics, the far right parties in France, in Germany, in Italy, far left parties, France as well. I mean, they're very, very significant considerations there. And of course, the populist movements are just expanding more significantly. But there's always hope. We saw the far right government in Hungary and Viktor Orban collapse recently, and a more centrist government come in, and we had a great conversation about that a couple of weeks ago on the podcast. So I think there's still hope, but yes, you are right to identify those as very significant international risks we should be monitoring. But thank you very much for coming on the International Risk Podcast today. I enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, likewise. It's been great. Thanks so much.
Well, that was a great conversation with Dr. Duncan Depledge. I really appreciated hearing his thoughts on the future of military preparedness, as well as the Arctic and climate change. I'm Dominic Bowen, your host. Thanks very much for listening. We will speak again in the next couple of days.